In every community, there's always someone people lean on without hesitation. The one who shows up with warm meals when tragedy strikes. The one who holds your hand at a bedside when hope begins to fade. The one whose presence feels like comfort itself. In the German city of Bremen, that person was Gesche Gottfried. She was seen as a quiet, selfless soul. A woman who had endured more loss than most could fathom. First her husband, then her parents, then close friends. Grief seemed to orbit her like a shadow. And yet, she never withdrew. She never hardened. Instead, she poured more love into the world. She became a caregiver to the forgotten, a light in dark places. To the people of Bremen, she was simply the angel. But that angelic glow was a mask. Because while the townspeople saw compassion, they missed the pattern, missed how so many around her fell ill, how death seemed to follow wherever she went, always quietly, always tragically, yet never suspiciously. Not at first. She didn't rage, she didn't steal, she didn't lash out. What she did was far more chilling. She played the long game, patient, gentle, deadly. The tears she shed at funerals, they weren't always for the dead. The meals she brought to the sick, not all of them were meant to heal. Gesche's kindness wasn't a gift, it was the bait. Her crimes weren't about revenge, they weren't about fortune. They were about something far harder to understand. Control, power, and a cold calculation that hid behind a warm smile. This wasn't a story of rage that spiraled out of hand. This was strategy. Rehearsed, repeated. It was the kind of horror that doesn't scream, it whispers. And people listen because they trust the whisper more than they'd ever trust a scream. This case is a mirror reflecting just how fragile our instincts can be. How easily the face of kindness can be weaponized. How the ones we praise as saints can sometimes walk with poison in their pockets and never raise suspicion. So when we talk about Gesche Gottfried, we're not just revisiting an old crime. We're peeling back the layers of human psychology. We're examining the places where grief and manipulation intersect. We're exploring how belief, faith in goodness, can sometimes be the very thing that blinds us. This is a story of trust betrayed at its deepest level. This is the case of Gesche Gottfried, and once you hear it, you won't forget it. Not because it's loud or violent, but because it's quiet, and that somehow makes it even more terrifying. In the early 1800s, Bremen stood tall and orderly, a city built on discipline, trade, and quiet dignity. Nestled along the Weser River, its bustling docks and tidy town squares reflected a place proud of its heritage. Bakers opened before sunrise, bells tolled from stone churches, tailors stitched in rhythm with cobblers and merchants, each day echoing the same routine. Respectability mattered, reputation was currency. And in this world, a woman's life was mapped out before she even learned to write her name. She was expected to be obedient, gracious, always busy, never loud. A good wife kept house and bore children without complaint. A good mother absorbed pain in silence. And if life brought her sorrow, as it often did, she was expected to swallow it with grace and press on. That was the world Gesche Margaretha Timm was born into in 1785. Her father made clothes, her mother repaired them. They weren't poor, but they weren't people of influence either. What they had was order. Strong routines, modest pride, and an unwavering belief in duty. Gesche grew up under those expectations. She was taught to be proper, polite, and poised, and she played the part so well no one ever thought to look beneath the surface. She was lovely, yes, but more than that, she was composed, gentle, capable. People liked her instantly, but not because she dazzled them, because she didn't. She was exactly what people thought a woman should be. She married young, as expected. She gave birth to 3 children, as expected. And when her husband passed suddenly, people sighed with sympathy, but didn't ask questions. Tragedy, after all, was part of life. Disease could take someone in a single night. Typhoid, consumption, a fever that wouldn't break. That's just how things were. But as the years went on, so did the losses. One by one, those around Gesche fell ill, and still she remained steady. Still she smiled. Still she cooked meals and sat by sick beds and cried at funerals with convincing sincerity. To the outside world, it all seemed like cruel coincidence. A woman struck again and again by fate's unkind hand. But the truth was far more chilling. What unfolded behind closed doors was not just a string of misfortunes, it was a calculated series of choices. Deaths that looked natural. Illnesses that seemed expected. Patterns that should have been obvious, but weren't, because no one dared suspect the one who looked so devoted. What makes this story so disturbing isn't just the poison or the number of lives it claimed. It's the way she moved through society unnoticed, not because she was hiding, but because no one thought to look. She blended in by fulfilling the role perfectly. She wore the mask of the ideal woman so convincingly, no one considered that it could be a disguise. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the stranger in the shadows, it's the one offering you tea with a soft smile and steady hands. This is more than a true crime case. It's a study in how gender roles can become armor, how our most trusted expectations can become blind spots, and how evil doesn't always need to shout to be heard. It can whisper from a face we're conditioned to trust. In Gesche Gottfried's world, kindness became camouflage, and for over a decade, no one saw what she was truly capable of. At first, no one saw anything unusual. Just another young widow trying to piece together a life in a world that wasn't built to support her. When Gesche's husband died in 1813, she did what grieving women were expected to do. She mourned quietly, she wore the widow's black, she avoided attention, and behind the heavy doors of her modest home, she was left to care for 3 children, alone. In those days, loss wasn't rare. What was rare was help. There were no pensions, no government aid, no charity beyond what your neighbours might spare. A widow was expected to either find another husband or quietly fade into the margins, dependent on relatives, if she had any left. Gesche had too much pride for that. She wouldn't beg and she didn't fall apart. She cooked, she cleaned, she held her family together with tired hands and a quiet smile. And when her mother took ill, Gesche did what everyone in town expected of her. She became the caretaker. Neighbours would pass by and hear her through the shutters, humming lullabies, reciting quiet prayers, whispering through the night. When her mother finally passed, those same neighbours said Gesche looked hollow, not dramatic, not hysterical, just quietly undone. Then, like falling dominoes, came the children. Her daughters lost their colour. They stopped playing, stopped laughing. Doctors visited, but the medicine of the time offered little hope. And when her son, the last of her children, cried out once in the dark and then fell silent forever, the city wrapped her in mourning. But even then, no suspicions, no whispers, because what they saw wasn't a curse, it was courage. Gesche kept lighting candles in her window at night. She kept baking bread. She still nodded politely to neighbours, still offered a kind word, still brought soup to the sick. The grief that hung over her home didn't seem strange anymore. It seemed like the natural burden of a woman who had endured too much. She was the kind of woman you thanked for showing up, the kind who always remembered the birthdays of other people's children, even though she'd buried her own. She had become something sacred in the eyes of Bremen, the quiet saint. So when she began looking after her elderly father, no one questioned it. Who else would do it? She was, after all, the strongest person most of them knew. But what people rarely realise is this. Real strength can be dangerous when it turns inward. Some people react to grief by shutting the world out. Some lash out. Others let the pain calcify into rage. But there's a third kind, quieter, harder to see. The kind who keeps giving until the giving becomes a kind of performance. Until kindness becomes a shield. Until suffering becomes the stage on which control is silently exercised. Not all masks are meant to dazzle. Some are meant to calm. Gesche understood something chilling. People don't fear the woman who sobs in the street. They fear the one who stays calm, the one who smiles after the storm. And that's who she became. The grieving woman who never stopped giving, who carried everyone else's burdens with poise. But underneath it all, something else was growing. Not rage, not sadness, something colder, more deliberate, more dangerous. For years, Gesche Gottfried was simply part of the backdrop in Bremen. Familiar. Quiet. A woman whose life had been steeped in loss, but whose grace in the face of it gave others comfort. She'd been seen at funeral after funeral, always dressed in black, always dignified. People whispered about her sorrow with a kind of reverence, as if she'd become fluent in grief the way others spoke of joy. Tragedy seemed to orbit her, and somehow she wore it well. No one questioned her presence. No one imagined they should, until Paul Zimmermann died. He wasn't old, he wasn't fragile, he was healthy, active, a man people saw daily, full of life. And then without warning came the pain. Sharp, unrelenting. He was gone within days. And Gesche, she was by his side the entire time. She brought him soup, sat by his bed, whispered soft words as his breathing slowed. To anyone watching, she was the same nurturing figure she'd always been. But this time something felt off. His death didn't slide into the city's long list of tragedies as smoothly as the others had. People paused. Something tugged at them, something they couldn't name yet. Then it happened again. A neighbour who regularly shared meals with Gesche fell violently ill. Then a close companion she had visited not long before. Then the town's elderly music teacher, still sharp, still active, was suddenly bedridden, her body weakening rapidly from unexplained stomach pain. Each death whispered of something familiar, sudden onset, escalating agony, organs failing without warning. And each time, Gesche was there, not as a suspect, as a comfort. The woman who brought warm broth and calming prayers, who stayed when others left, who soothed as others wept. At first, the city tried to rationalise. Disease spread easily in Bremen. Spoiled food, poor hygiene, tight quarters. It was easy to get sick. These were coincidences. That's what people told themselves. But coincidences don't repeat like clockwork. They don't walk hand in hand with the same smiling face. And one by one, people began to sense it. This wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't spoken outright, not yet. But the air shifted. The kindness they once accepted without hesitation, they started leaving it untouched. The woman they once praised in hushed admiration, they now watched with lingering eyes. Not because anyone had evidence, because their instincts whispered something they couldn't ignore. The unease wasn't loud. There was no crime scene, no shattering scream, just a string of deaths that arrived like quiet echoes, one after the other. And standing in the middle of all that silence, one woman, unflinching, composed, present at nearly every moment of suffering, yet untouched by it. And that's what began to truly terrify them. Not what she did, but how calm she seemed as the world around her kept dying. Johann and Wilhelmina Rumpel thought they were offering kindness, maybe a little charity, maybe something closer to reverence. After all, this was Gesche Gottfried, Bremen's unofficial angel of mercy. When they purchased her former home, they didn't ask her to leave it entirely. Instead, they invited her in, offered her a place to stay, a role to play. She would manage the household, supervise the staff, and bring the same grace and steadiness she was known for across the city. It felt like hiring a beloved family member, a familiar presence to ease the transitions of life. But what they didn't know was what they had let inside. Soon after Gesche moved in, Wilhelmina fell ill. The symptoms were subtle at first. A few days of discomfort, then a heaviness in her stomach, then the pain sharpened. Fatigue dragged her down. She stopped eating, could barely stand. And just like always, Gesche was there at her side, spoon-feeding soup, dabbing her forehead, whispering gentle words that sounded like prayer. And when Wilhelmina died, everyone did what they always did. They praised Gesche's loyalty, her kindness, her strength. Even Wilhelmina, in her final days, told her husband she was comforted by the thought that Gesche would be there to help him carry the loss. And Gesche was. She stayed. She cooked. She ran the household like it was her own. She monitored the staff, ordered supplies, oversaw every detail of daily life. And then the staff began to fall ill. First the maid, then the nurse. Both women complained of the same sharp pains, nausea, dizziness, an invisible weight dragging their bodies down. At first, no one saw a pattern. People get sick. It happens. But the nurse recovered. And when she did, she didn't stay silent. She went to Johann. She told him she couldn't stay in the house any longer, that she didn't feel safe, that something wasn't right, that the only constant in every sickness was Gesche. She quickly became one of the most haunting figures in Danish history. Not because she looked the part, but because she didn't. She was a woman, a mother, someone who was supposed to protect life, not erase it. Her case cracked something open in the public consciousness, because it wasn't just about the crimes, it was about everything that let those crimes happen. Denmark had created a system where unmarried mothers were punished, not with jail, but with shame. They were pushed to the margins, their children became burdens, their pain was kept private. And that secrecy, that silence was Dagmar's cover. She wasn't a lone monster. She was a symptom. The trial began in 1921. The courtroom filled with curious faces and silent judgment. Reporters scribbled, neighbours whispered. And Dagmar? She walked in quietly with the same eerie calm she always carried. Not angry, not remorseful, not defensive, just still. She admitted to killing more than a dozen infants. The court could only verify 9. That's what the charges reflected. 9 lives, 9 disappearances they could prove. The rest vanished without a trace. And Dagmar offered no defence, no insanity plea, no tearful explanation. She didn't beg, she didn't justify. She said what she did, and then stopped talking. The courtroom waited for some kind of crack in her mask. Guilt, horror, even regret. But nothing came. When the sentence was handed down, it was historic. Death. For a woman in Denmark, that was nearly unheard of. But just as the country absorbed the weight of that verdict, something unexpected happened. The king intervened. He commuted the sentence to life in prison and gave only one reason. In Denmark, we do not put our women to death. That simple sentence sparked a firestorm. To some, it was mercy she never earned. To others, it was a final act of national principle. Justice without blood. Either way, Dagmar Overby would live the rest of her days behind bars. She never spoke publicly again. She never offered closure. In 1929, she died in prison. Quietly, just as she had lived. There were no last words, no confessions, no closure. And yet her story didn't fade. Because Dagmar Overby wasn't just a killer. She was a mirror. A reflection of what happens when society refuses to hear its most vulnerable and punishes them for needing help in the first place. Her victims weren't just the children who vanished. They were the mothers who lived on, haunted, silenced, and forgotten. And long after the trial ended, Denmark was left with the question that no one could quite answer. How many more Dagmars had gone unnoticed? And how many more would follow? This case, unlike anything Denmark had ever seen, ripped open something far more disturbing than a string of murders. It uncovered a system that had left its most vulnerable completely alone. It showed a world where women, cast out for having children at the wrong time or under the wrong conditions, had no real options, where shame suffocated logic and survival meant handing over your child to a stranger and hoping for mercy. Dagmar Overby didn't just kill, she held up a mirror to an entire society, and what stared back wasn't evil in disguise, it was neglect. Because evil, in this story, didn't have claws or bloodshot eyes. It wore modest skirts, boiled tea, spoke gently and smiled as it shut the door behind a crying mother. In the wake of Dagmar's trial, Denmark couldn't look away anymore. The country changed. It was the work of someone who wanted power, not chaos, and who wielded that power not with a weapon, but with kindness, with meals, with trust, and always with a smile. The day Gesche was arrested, it sent shockwaves through Bremen, not because people feared her, but because they couldn't bear the thought that they had loved a lie. For years, she had been the city's quiet saint, the kind of woman others leaned on, the kind who made sorrow seem survivable. To accept that she was the one crafting that sorrow, that meant questioning their own judgment, their own instincts, their own ability to tell good from evil. But the facts kept mounting. And as the truth started to crack through the surface, people remembered things. Small details that never seemed strange before. How illness always trailed behind her visits. How she insisted on cooking meals herself, even in other people's homes. How her friends and relatives often died right after lending her money or forgiving a debt. It all started to add up. What had once looked like coincidence now reeked of something far more deliberate. And it didn't stay a local scandal for long. The story spread, first through the region, then across Germany. Headlines turned her into a sensation. The country was transfixed. It had all the elements of a horror story wrapped in the face of a woman no one ever suspected. Behind prison walls, Gesche remained composed, at least at first. She denied everything, spoke softly, held herself like a martyr wrongfully accused. But time wears on, even the most careful performance. As the evidence grew and more victims were named, she started to crack. Confronted with testimony, lab results, timelines, witnesses, she confessed, not to one murder, to 15 lives, all taken slowly, deliberately, not with violence, but with poison baked into daily routine. She had killed husbands, her own children, close friends, even her parents. The method? Arsenic mixed into butter or lard, spread across bread or folded into pastries. A dose here, a dose there. No one noticed. The symptoms mimicked ordinary illness. And Gesche, ever helpful, was always nearby when they worsened. To outsiders, it looked like a cruel streak of bad luck. To her, it was control disguised as caretaking. As her time in custody stretched on, the image of the composed widow began to unravel. Guards whispered that she talked to the dead in her sleep, that she sobbed uncontrollably, then returned minutes later with a soft smile and graceful posture, as if nothing had happened. Was it remorse, madness, or just another mask? No one could be sure. What they did know was this: the woman once praised as a symbol of grace was now one of the most notorious serial killers in German history. And the scariest part? She didn't look like a monster. She looked like the person you trusted most. When the trial finally began, 3 years after her arrest, it was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a public reckoning. The courtroom was packed. Journalists elbowed for space, their pens scratching furiously as they recorded every expression, every word. Crowds gathered outside, straining to catch a glimpse of the woman who had once embodied sorrow and now stood accused of orchestrating it. Gesche Gottfried. The woman who had once been wrapped in sympathy was now under the harshest spotlight. Her defense pushed one argument. This couldn't have been the act of a sane person. How could any woman poison those closest to her, her children, her parents, her friends, unless her mind had splintered? Unless grief had unmoored her from reality? But the prosecution told a different story, not one of madness, but of method. They described a woman who wasn't driven by money or hatred, but by something far more disturbing, a need to be needed. She wasn't eliminating people for convenience, she was creating illness, slowly, deliberately, just to step in as the rescuer, the nurturer, the irreplaceable caregiver. This wasn't generosity, it was control disguised as kindness. The prosecutors called it what modern psychology might now label factitious disorder imposed on others. A twisted psychological profile where care becomes control, where poisoning becomes a means to feel important, where compassion becomes a weapon. She didn't just want attention, she wanted dependence. By keeping others weak, she made herself strong. By making others sick, she gave herself purpose. It wasn't murder for revenge, it was murder for meaning. And when the verdict came in, guilty on all counts, the room didn't erupt in noise. It froze. There was no joy, no gasps, just the grim stillness of people realizing how easily they had been fooled. A quiet acknowledgement that, for years, they had embraced a predator wrapped in the skin of a saint. The court sentenced her to death. As was the custom of the time, the execution would be held in the town's cathedral square in front of the very community that once mourned beside her. She was allowed one final request, a glass of wine. She accepted it with composure, drank it slowly, handed the empty glass back. Not a tremble, not a tear. But when the guards brought her the dress she was to wear to her execution, she hesitated. Not because of what it symbolized, but because she didn't like it. It wasn't elegant enough. Not the judgment, not the gallows, not the fact that her crimes had been laid bare. Allah, the dress. That was what disappointed her. And in that one shallow detail, caring more about the fabric draped on her body than the weight of her crimes, she told the world exactly who she was. No words were needed. It was the clearest confession she ever gave. On April 21st, 1831, a blade dropped in Bremen's cathedral square. With it, the city ended more than a life. It ended a lie. Gesche Gottfried, once revered as a symbol of grace in grief, was no longer a figure of compassion. She had become a haunting lesson in how easily kindness can be faked and how dangerously close that performance can come to perfection. Her execution, Bremen's last public one, drew crowds not for justice, but for reckoning. A town that once wept with her now stood in silence, forced to confront just how completely they'd been fooled. Because Gesche didn't hide in alleyways or wear the mask of a villain. She moved through the city as a helper, a healer, a mother figure. Her weapon wasn't rage, it was reliability. Her disguise wasn't a costume, it was everything society told her to be. And she followed that script to the letter. She didn't step outside the role of the ideal woman, she used it as cover. She turned nurturing into a tool of control. She made devotion look effortless, even as her victims fell one by one. Not because she betrayed expectations, but because she met them too well. That's what made her so lethal. The community never suspected her, not because she was invisible, but because she was admired. Her poison wasn't just in the food, it was in the trust. 15 lives were lost under her care, some slowly, others swiftly, all while she sang, smiled, and wept with believable sorrow. For historians and psychologists alike, her case remains an unnerving blueprint, where control was masked as compassion, and where the performance of virtue became the perfect camouflage for violence. It forces us to uncomfortable questions. How often do we assume suffering makes someone good? How easily do we confuse composure with innocence? And who do we excuse, simply because they appear to be everything we expect them to be? Gesche's name doesn't often surface in the headlines today. She doesn't dominate modern documentaries or top 10 lists, but her story remains a shadow on the margins of every tale, where kindness turns cold and where empathy is used as bait. Because what truly unsettles us about Gesche Gottfried isn't just the number of people she killed, it's that no one saw her coming. And maybe, just maybe, that means someone like her could still be walking among us, behind the warmth, behind the service, behind the smile.